Once upon a time, in the heart of the medieval ages, there lay a village nestled beside a slow-moving river where mist crept gently across the meadows and dew gathered like tiny crystals upon the wild grasses. In this quiet realm, far removed from courts and kings, the world of women was as vital as it was hidden, their lives woven with threads of duty, silence, resilience, and sometimes sorrow. Our story begins not with a grand lady or a crowned queen, but with a woman of the loom, Matilda, a weaver whose fingers danced each day through wool and linen, telling her own silent stories through pattern and color. Her cottage was one of modest stone and timber, its thatched roof sagging in places but holding firm against the rains. Inside, the scent of wood smoke lingered always, mingling with the dry smell of yarn and the earthy tang of stored roots. Matilda rose before the first cockcrow. Like many women of her station, her mornings were borrowed from the darkness, those brief hours before the world stirred. Her bones ached from the cold as she wrapped a woolen shawl about her shoulders. The hearth was dead, and she would have to coax it back to life with careful breath and dried moss. The act was ritualistic, a morning prayer of flame and patience. Outside, the fog lay low. The fields whispered in silence, interrupted only by the cluck of restless hens or the bleating of a sheep troubled in its sleep. Matilda took in the morning like one drinks from a still cup, slowly, with reverence. For though her days were marked by hardship, they were hers alone to shape, however faintly. She lit her lamp, its dim glow dancing across the walls, revealing shelves of neatly spun spindles and worn tools passed down from her mother's hands. There was poetry in the simplicity of her world. And yet, beneath its poetry ran veins of exhaustion, of quiet worry, and of the unspoken price exacted from women who bore the weight of labor and obedience without question. As she tended the loom, her shuttle flying through warp and weft, she thought of the seasons. In winter, her hands cracked and bled. In summer, she fainted in the heat. There was no respite, no holiday. The cloth must be made. Linen for the abbey, wool for the merchant's son, rough canvas for the fishwives. Each order brought coin, and each coin in turn was traded for the barest essentials, salt, candles, soap. But Matilda's life was not without fragments of joy. She had a cat named Porridge, who slept beside the hearth like a small twitching shadow. There were wildflowers in spring, and sometimes songs shared with other women at the riverbank. Laughter did not always come easily, but when it did, it bloomed bright and defiant. Still, life was a tightrope strung between obedience and survival. Women like Matilda lived under layers of expectations. Sow this, bear that, be silent, endure. Her neighbors watched her closely, not with cruelty, but with the quiet hunger of those who feared stepping beyond their own borders. Rumors grew faster than crops, and a single misstep could brand a woman with suspicion. She recalled, just days past, the tanner's wife accused of witchcraft for owning a red ribbon said to bring fertility. The ribbon had been passed down, nothing more, but it was enough. The woman now sat in a locked cell awaiting the bishop's word. Matilda shuddered. A ribbon. That was all it took. By mid-morning, the village stirred. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the soft din of footsteps on packed earth echoed like the world's quiet awakening. Matilda packed her woven goods into a basket, covered them with flax cloth, and prepared for the walk to the market square. Her shawl clung tightly about her shoulders as she stepped into the mist. The road was muddy, and each footfall left its mark. She passed hedgerows tangled with brambles, and an old wooden shrine where a figure of the Virgin watched her with wooden eyes. Matilda paused a moment, touching the cross that hung from her neck, whispering a silent plea for good sales and safe passage. In the market square, noise replaced the serenity of dawn. Women jostled for bread, traders shouted prices, and children darted through the legs of the crowd like sprightly spirits. Matilda found her usual place near the steps of the guild hall and unfolded her wares. A merchant's wife approached, fingering the cloth with a critical eye. "This one's tight in the weave," she said, nodding. "I'll take 2. No phrase, I hope?" Matilda only smiled softly and bowed her head. The coins exchanged hands. It was enough to keep her going a few more days. And so the day passed, slow and enduring. When she returned home, her legs were tired, her arms heavy, and her mind dulled by the noise and bartering. She cooked a thin stew of leeks and barley, fed the cat, and mended a tear in her own apron by candlelight. As the stars emerged overhead and the night curled itself around the village like a woolen shawl, Matilda lay beneath her patched blanket. The fire dimmed to embers. She thought again of the tanner's wife and the red ribbon, of the weight all women carried in silence. Her last thoughts before drifting to sleep were not of saints or kings, but of threads, fragile, persistent threads, and the hands that wove them through a world that often failed to see them. When the moon hung low in the sky, casting silver shadows upon the thatched roofs and crooked fences of the village, there was one woman who did not rest, even when others dreamed beneath their woolen quilts. Her name was Elfrida, and she was the midwife. Elfrida's cottage sat on the edge of the village, where fields gave way to wood, and the bramble thickets whispered in tongues no man dared translate. Her home smelled not of bread or burning logs, but of rosemary, ash, and tallow. Strange herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, dried fennel, rue, and mugwort, each bound with thread the color of bone. She was a woman of knowledge, and because of this, she was both revered and feared. They came to her in the dead of night, laboring mothers, young girls in quiet shame, wives with empty bellies and tearful prayers. Elfrida never turned them away. Her hands were steady, her voice low and soothing like water over smooth stones. But though she served without fail, her heart was not unburdened. On this night, she sat by candlelight, polishing the iron instruments of her trade. The birthing stool had been repaired again, its legs splintering from use. The brass bowl she used for washing blood was dark with age. In her lap, a leather book lay open, not of scripture, but of her own notes, carefully recorded over the years in a script she learned from her grandmother, who had learned from hers. Elfrida knew the secrets of the womb, the rhythms of a woman's blood, the signs of a coming child, the subtle turn of fate that decided life or death in the moment of crowning. Yet she bore no illusions of safety, for knowledge in the hands of a woman was a dangerous thing. She had seen it many times, a herbal remedy misused, a tincture misunderstood, and whispers of sorcery followed like wolves through the snow. She still remembered the old crone from the next village over, burned by decree of a nervous bailiff who blamed her for the sickness that took his son. The smoke had risen high and bitter that day. Elfrida had stood among the watchers, her hands clenched tightly beneath her cloak, her eyes refusing to look away. From that day on, she had become quieter, more careful. Her solitude was her shield. That morning, she was called by the bell, 3 slow rings from the chapel's rope, a signal that life was arriving early. Elfrida rose without complaint, tying her cloak with practiced hands. The chill crept through her bones, but she ignored it. She packed her satchel with linens, herbs, and oil, and stepped into the gray light of dawn. At the blacksmith's home, a young woman lay writhing on a straw-filled mattress. Her face was pale, her breath short. Her husband stood uselessly nearby, shifting from foot to foot, holding a damp cloth with trembling hands. Elfrida nodded once to him. She needed no words. She took command of the room with gentle authority. The windows were open to let the spirits move freely. Candles were lit, prayers whispered under her breath, not from a psalter, but from something older, something passed down through generations of women who had birthed and buried with equal grace. For hours, the labor raged. The woman screamed, wept, begged. Elfrida was unmoved, though not unfeeling. Her hands stayed firm, her instructions calm. Finally, just as the morning sun kissed the horizon, the child came. A boy, red and wailing. Elfrida wrapped him quickly in linen, tied the cord, and passed him to the mother, who sobbed with relief. The husband tried to speak, but Elfrida only held out her hand for payment. He placed a few silver coins in her palm, too few, but enough. She left without waiting for thanks. Outside, the sky had turned the color of milk. Elfrida's boots crunched frost as she walked home. The village seemed hushed in her wake. Dogs barked softly from behind fences, and chickens rustled in coops. The world continued, blind to what had transpired in the small, dark room. At her cottage, she poured hot water into a basin and washed her arms, scrubbing until the blood was gone. Then she sat, exhausted by the fire, where the cat blinked at her from the hearth. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her book and wrote the birth into her records. Date, name, conditions, remedies used. She wrote carefully, always in code, in case another set of eyes ever found the pages. And then she paused. There was something she had not told the blacksmith's wife. A shadow she had seen in the woman's eyes, a sign of blood that ran too long, too thin. Elfrida feared the fever would come, but she could not stay. She could only pray, in her own quiet way, that the next visit would not be to prepare a shroud. Her life was one of edges, between life and death, trust and suspicion, healing and danger. She was a woman with knowledge in a world that punished knowing. But she would endure. She had to. For no one else would walk the path she walked, and no one else, she feared, would understand the burden she carried. And as sleep finally came to claim her, she dreamed not of safety or ease, but of firelight on stone floors, of whispers through time, and of the countless mothers who had clutched her hand in the dark. The bells of St. Marwan's Chapel rang faint and hollow in the midday air, their voices swept by the wind across rolling hills and stone-walled fields. In the manor house beyond the village, its windows narrow and its halls cold despite the summer sun, a girl sat by the leaded glass, sewing quietly, her needle tracing tiny roses into the hem of a silk veil. Her name was Cecily. She was just past her 15th year, with hair like polished chestnut and eyes the color of moss after rain. The steward called her fair. The bishop called her a blessing. The baron called her his investment. Cecily called herself nothing at all. For though she had been born to a family of minor standing, lords of a patch of northern land, often more snow than soil, her beauty had raised her worth like a crop newly ripened. She was not foolish. She knew what her dowry meant and what her silence bought. She had long since stopped speaking of dreams. The chamber where she lived was pleasant, in the way a gilded cage might please a bird. Tapestries lined the walls, their threads dyed in expensive shades of crimson and gold. She slept on a feather mattress and ate from pewter dishes. Her hands were kept clean, her skin protected from the sun, but all of it was preparation, not for her comfort, but for her sale. There had been a man who came last spring, Lord Edric of Cumberley, a knighted cousin of some higher house, rotund with wealth and fond of his own voice. He had seen her only once, as she watered the manor garden, and had decided. Her father agreed with little hesitation. The lands would be merged, her womb would bear heirs. The bargain was struck before Cecily's opinion was ever asked. She was to be wed in autumn, and so her lessons intensified. How to kneel without creasing her gown, how to pour wine with grace, how to obey. The mistress of the manor, Lady Marian, her aunt, taught with sharp glances and sharper words. "You are fortunate," the lady often reminded her, smoothing Cecily's hair with fingers like chilled porcelain. "You will wear fine gowns and have your own hearth. Not every girl is so blessed." But Cecily felt no blessing, only a quiet hollowness that echoed through her bones, like wind through the empty halls of the old priory. Each night, when the candles burned low, she pressed her fingers to the glass of her window and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, the village girls sang by the riverbank. She could almost hear their laughter carried on the breeze, though she hadn't joined them in years. She was to be a lady now, removed, refined, untouchable. But in truth, all she longed for was to run barefoot in the orchard, to taste honey from her own spoon, to speak without consequence. One evening, as twilight wrapped the manor in shades of violet, her chamber door creaked open. A servant entered, a girl not much older than Cecily, with rough hands and soot-smudged sleeves. Her name was Bryn. She had grown up among the lower halls, daughter of the cook, and remembered Cecily from games played in secret under the table when they were both small. "I brought the lavender," Bryn whispered, setting the bundle beside the basin, "to help you sleep." Cecily nodded and hesitated. Then, with voice barely above breath, she asked, "Do you think I'll be happy?" Bryn looked at her, truly looked, and then sat on the edge of the bed. "I think happiness isn't given to girls like us," she said. "Only chances to survive. If you're lucky, your husband will be kind. If not, well, you learn to make yourself small and quiet and wait for the days to pass." Cecily swallowed hard. Her fingers twisted in the hem of her nightdress. "Do you think he'll hurt me?" "I think you'll find ways to pretend he doesn't," Bryn replied softly. They sat in silence a while, the scent of lavender blooming in the still air. Then Bryn rose and disappeared like a shadow slipping beneath the door. The next morning, the preparations resumed. A goldsmith arrived from the city to fit her betrothal ring. The chapel was swept, and the clerk rehearsed the binding vows aloud as if the walls themselves needed reminding. Lady Marian oversaw it all with the stern pride of someone arranging a chessboard. Cecily said nothing. She smiled when required. She lowered her gaze when spoken to. She bit her lip until it bled rather than let the sobs rise. The day before her departure to Lord Edric's estate, she was gifted a new gown of deep blue, embroidered with silver thread. "It will bring out your eyes," her aunt said. "He'll be pleased." That night, Cecily did not sleep. She sat at her window until dawn, watching the stars flicker and fade into the first gray blush of morning. She clutched the lavender Bryn had given her, now wilted and dry, and whispered names she barely remembered, of games, of laughter, of a life now ended. The wedding bells would ring soon, and she would become someone else, someone silent, obedient, and well-kept, a lady of a cold stone hall, a womb with a name, a bargain wrapped in blue silk. In the convent of Saint Elidua, where the garden was always quiet and the wind sang low through ancient cloisters, a woman knelt in prayer long after the others had gone to sleep. Her name was Sister Agnes, though in another life she had once been Anne of Darford, a daughter, a dreamer, and for a brief time a girl who believed she would choose her own path. Now she was the bride of Christ. She had been cloistered at 16. Her father, burdened by too many daughters and too little land, declared her soul too pure for marriage. The second daughter, Margaret, had been promised to a merchant. The third, Eleanor, was yet young enough to remain pliant. But Anne, clever, questioning Anne, was best placed behind stone and scripture. There had been no scandal, no rebellion, only a quiet insistence in her eyes, a sharpness that made noblemen uncomfortable. So they placed her behind the convent's walls, called it a divine calling, and sealed the door. She remembered her first night vividly, the sound of the great gates closing behind her, the candlelight flickering against stone, the dry chant of psalms whispered by lips that had long ago forgotten what it meant to laugh. The abbess had welcomed her with the same tone one might use to greet a book returned to its shelf. Her hair was shorn, her silk gown replaced with rough wool, her name Anne stripped away like a leaf from its branch. She became Agnes. Each morning began with the same bell. Matins before dawn, when the sky was still heavy with stars. The prayers were unchanging, a rhythm carved into the bones of the day. Meals were taken in silence. The only music came from their voices lifted in plain song, echoing high in the chapel like ghostly wings. At first, she had tried to embrace the life. She found moments of beauty in the stillness, the play of sunlight on the cloister wall, the scent of rosemary in the garden, the careful ink strokes of illuminated texts. But the silence, which the other sisters wore like a second veil, chafed at her. It pressed against her ribs like a tightening corset. In her heart, questions bloomed. Why must the word of God be only spoken by men? Why must women cover their heads, their voices, their desires? The abbess warned her gently, then sternly. Such thoughts were seeds of pride, dangerous to the soul. She tried to kill them. She fasted, she prayed, she walked barefoot in winter, but still the questions clung to her like ivy, winding up her spirit, pulling her back toward something that felt like truth. Once, a traveling friar came to deliver a sermon on divine obedience. His words were fire and thunder, declaring that women were vessels of temptation, that Eve's sin echoed in every daughter born. Afterward, Agnes approached him with lowered eyes and asked, "If Eve sinned first, yet Adam followed, is he not just as weak?" The friar blinked. He stammered something about divine order and left without answering. The abbess heard of it, of course. For days afterward, Agnes scrubbed the chapel floor with lye until her hands bled. It was called penance, but to her it was only silence in another form. Her only true solace came in the scriptorium. There, she copied manuscripts with careful grace, lives of saints, psalters, and bestiaries. Sometimes, when the mistress of texts looked away, she slipped tiny marks of rebellion into the margins. A fox with the face of a bishop, a woman dancing barefoot among thorns, her own initials hidden in vines. She told no one. In the evenings, when the bell tolled Compline and the others retired to their cells, Agnes would linger in the chapel. She lit a single candle and knelt beneath the painted crucifix, gazing not at Christ's suffering, but at Mary's face beside him. The Virgin's eyes were gentle, yes, but also distant, as if she too longed for something beyond her station. Agnes whispered to her, "Not prayers, but confessions of the soul. I want to speak, I want to choose. I want to be seen not as a vessel, but as a voice." Mary never answered. One winter, a letter arrived. Her younger sister Eleanor was to be wed, and a gift was requested from the convent. Agnes was assigned to prepare it, a lace-trimmed veil and a small prayer book. As she embroidered the veil by candlelight, her fingers trembling slightly, she imagined Eleanor's face, rosy with anticipation or dread, she could not know. Was her sister grateful for the life Agnes had been denied, or did she mourn for her freedom as Agnes did? In the pages of the prayer book, Agnes painted a tiny bird in flight. Beneath its wings, in letters too small to notice unless one looked closely, she wrote, "Be what I could not." When the parcel was sent, she stood long at the gate, watching the courier disappear into the snow. She felt no bitterness, only a strange emptiness, as though some part of her had flown with the bird. Years passed. Agnes grew older, her hair silvering beneath her veil. Her voice deepened with age, though she used it less and less. Her hands remained steady, her eyes sharp. She had never known the touch of a man, never walked beyond the convent walls again. But her spirit, though pressed and pressed, never quite crumpled. And sometimes, late at night, she would still sit by the window slit and dream of fields beyond stone, of freedom whispered not in rebellion, but in the quiet persistence of a mind unbroken. The stocks in the village square were old and cracked, their wood darkened by years of weather and weeping. Children avoided them in play, as if the stains upon them might leap up like curses. But on a gray morning in March, they held a woman whose name once stirred both admiration and envy, Edith, wife of Thomas the Cooper. Now she was only the fallen. She knelt beneath the judgment of the town, not in a chapel, but upon cold, muddied earth, her wrists locked in wood, her hair unbound and tangled. A sign hung around her neck, nailed hastily to a splintered plank, adulteress. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. Thomas had returned early from a journey and found her laughing with the shepherd's apprentice. No one could say for certain what had happened, only that her smile had vanished quickly, and her husband's rage had risen like a storm. There had been a hearing of sorts, if one could call it that. The bailiff and two elders listened to Thomas's accusations, while Edith stood in silence, clutching her apron. She was wanton, Thomas had said, his voice trembling with fury or fear. A disgrace beneath my roof, a sin in my bed. She had tried to speak, but her words twisted in her throat like vines around stone. No one asked the boy, nor questioned what laughter might mean to a woman left alone too long. In a world where silence was expected, her very joy had damned her. Now, she knelt with the wind in her face as the townspeople passed by. Some spat, others looked away. A few stared too long. She had once been praised for her fine embroidery, the crimson thread in her veils, her gentle voice during vespers. That woman was gone. Stripped by accusation, stripped by the cold. A rotten apple struck her shoulder. Laughter followed. It came from a group of boys too young to understand what sin meant, but old enough to enjoy its punishment. She did not cry. Her cheeks were already streaked with dried tears, and the sting of shame burned hotter than the wind. It was the third day of her sentence. When dusk fell, the curate came with bread and water. He knelt beside her, not in kindness, but in procedure. "Confess and be cleansed," he whispered. "I did nothing," she whispered back. He sighed. "Then your silence is your guilt." The fourth day brought rain, and with it, a strange stillness. No one lingered to watch. The world turned in its usual rhythm, bread to be baked, cows to be milked, wounds to be tended. The village did not stop for Edith. She was part of the landscape now, like the church bell or the road dust, but her mind did not still. She thought of her daughter, Joan, only 6, sent to stay with Thomas's cousin. Would Joan remember her mother as she was, braiding her hair with blue ribbons, singing lullabies, or as she had become, a broken thing hunched beneath a wooden yoke? She thought of her own mother, long dead, who had warned her in soft tones, "A woman's honor lives in her silence." Edith had believed that for years, until she realized silence could be twisted, reshaped, wielded by others like a blade. On the 5th day, she was released. Her legs could barely carry her, but she rose slowly, each joint screaming, Her back curved like a question mark. No one helped her stand. The sign was thrown into the fire. Her hands, raw and swollen, trembled as she pulled the shawl over her shoulders. It did little to warm her. She did not go home. Thomas had barred the door. His voice from within was firm and final. "You'll not darken this house again." So she wandered, a ghost beneath the eaves of buildings she once called familiar. No one opened their door. Few met her eyes. She became a thing unspeakable, the sort of woman whispered about when daughters misbehaved. At night, she slept in the abandoned mill among the mice and dry husks of grain. She wrapped herself in discarded cloth and listened to the river churn beyond the walls. Her body ached, her spirit fluttered like a torn banner, and yet she did not die. Each morning she rose and washed in the river, hands numb from the chill. She mended her old cloak with twine. She scavenged stale bread from the midden. It was not a life, not truly, but it was breath, and breath was a stubborn thing. Eventually, the whispers quieted. Other scandals rose, a piglet stolen, a boy drowned. The world moved forward, forgetting the spectacle of her shame. But Edith remembered. She remembered every face that spat, every stone that flew, every silence that screamed. She no longer wore color. She no longer prayed in public. But one day, when a girl ran crying from her father's blows, it was Edith who pulled her behind the hedgerow, who offered her a crust of bread and let her weep into the fraying wool of her cloak. "Why do they hate us?" the girl asked. "They don't," Edith answered, brushing the girl's hair with careful fingers. "They fear us, and fear wears many masks." The girl looked up. "But you're not afraid." "No," Edith said with a voice low and firm. "I lost my fear the day they tried to break me, and I found I could still walk." And so she did. She walked beyond the village, beyond the shame, into a new place where her name was hers again, not carved into wood or drowned in judgment. She became something else, not pure, not fallen, but endured. And in a world that had no room for the broken, endurance was the most powerful kind of defiance. In the shadow of the town's southern gate, where the stone walls rose tall and the wind swept dust into the eyes of the forgotten, there lay a crooked alley known only to those who had no other place. There, among crumbling wood and scraps of cloth, slept a girl whose name was rarely spoken, if it was ever known at all. She was the beggar's daughter. No christening had marked her arrival into the world. No priest had spoken prayers over her cradle. Her mother, Maria, had given birth beside a bakery's outer wall, clutching her swollen belly through a night of cold labor, her cries swallowed by the snow. The midwife had not come. There had been no candles, no water warmed by care, only blood, frost, and silence. The girl had survived. Many did not. They called her Little Linnet, after the songbird that perched atop the fence posts in spring. It was not her true name, if she had one, but it clung to her like soot to a chimney. Her eyes were bright, her hair tangled, her limbs thin as reeds. She grew up in corners, watching feet pass by, learning quickly which gestures meant kindness, which meant pain. Her mother begged by the church steps each morning, cupping her hands beneath the great stained glass window that cast saints in sunlight. Some gave farthings, others spat. Once a passing friar pressed bread into Maria's hand and whispered a blessing. But the next day, he looked past her as if she'd vanished into dust. Linnet watched it all. Her lessons were not of books or psalms, but of glances, refusals, and the language of survival. By 5, she knew which baker left crusts behind. By 7, she could spot a drunkard from 50 paces and vanish before his shadow touched her. By 10, she had learned how to feign blindness, twist her voice into pity, and cry without tears. But hunger did not learn. It gnawed always. Some winters, her fingers turned blue. One year, her toes blackened until 2 were gone. The healer would not see her. "She's no man's child," he said. "Not worth the herbs." Maria died the winter Linnet turned 11. No one knew of what. Some said cold, others whispered sickness. Linnet had woken to her mother's stillness, the thin blanket soaked with sweat. She'd held the lifeless hand until morning, then pulled the ragged cloth over the face and walked to the river. She did not cry. No one buried Maria. The body was carted away by the bailiff's men, tossed into the pauper's pit with no more ceremony than a sack of refuse. Linnet stood in the trees, hidden, watching the crows gather before the earth was even covered. After that, the world became sharper. She could not beg with a child's charm anymore. Her voice deepened. Her face thinned. She was no longer invisible. She was visible in the worst of ways. Men noticed. It began with lingering glances. Then coins left in her lap by those who stood too close. One day, a tanner offered her meat in exchange for an hour's time in the stables. She refused, running until her legs gave way. That night, she ate nothing. Another time, the miller's son cornered her near the well. She bit his hand so hard he bled. His mother screamed at her the next morning, calling her a demon child, a creature born of sin. The townsfolk whispered. She was cursed, they said. Bad luck followed her. The whispers made her dangerous. The danger made her free. She lived between places, in haylofts, under carts, sometimes in the crypt of the ruined chapel where moss grew thick upon the stone. She ate what the earth and indifference allowed. Once she caught a rabbit in a snare and wept from joy. Despite it all, she was not bitter. Some days she watched the river and dreamed. She dreamed of a home with fire in the hearth, of bread with honey, of hands that touched gently. She dreamed of learning to read, to write her name, to speak with words that held weight. She dreamed because dreams were the only riches she could carry. Then, in her 13th year, a woman came through the southern gate, a merchant's widow, traveling with her guards. She wore a dark cloak and eyes that had seen too much grief. She paused when she saw Linnet crouched by the roadside, cradling a bruised apple as if it were gold. "What is your name, child?" the woman asked. Linnet hesitated. "Linnet?" she said finally, her voice unsure. "Do you belong to anyone?" "No." The woman looked at her a long time. Then she said, "Come, I need a girl to tend my horse and keep my boots dry." Linnet followed. She did not know if it was salvation or simply another road, but she walked it anyway. Her legs were thin, her shoes ragged, but she walked. That night, for the first time in her memory, she slept beneath a roof that did not drip rain, beside a hearth that burned. She did not trust it, but she allowed herself, just once, to dream again. The banners fluttered gently from the highest turrets of Castle Dunhollow, their fabric soft as breath, dyed with the rich burgundy of old blood and the golden stag of the House of Wendell. Within those high stone walls, where tapestries warmed the drafty corridors and candles stood in iron sconces like sentinels of silence, lived Lady Isolde of Wendelmark, first daughter, third wife, and prisoner of her name. Her chamber stood in the tallest tower. It overlooked the rose garden, which was tended not by her hands but by men in leather aprons, and the chapel yard beyond, where the tombs of Wendell ancestors lined up like grim witnesses to duty. Isolde was not unloved, but she was unfree. She had been born beneath silk canopies to the lullabies of trained voices. Her milk had come from a wet nurse, her toys carved by artisans, her education guided by tutors who spoke in hushed tones. At 8, she learned to dance. At 10, to sew. At 13, to keep secrets. By 15, she was wed. Her husband, Lord Berengar, was more than twice her age, his beard streaked with silver, his voice low and commanding. He praised her composure, her pale hands, the evenness of her tone. "You are a mirror of grace," he once told her. She smiled and said thank you, though she did not know what part of herself he was seeing, only the image she had learned to reflect. She had not chosen him. That choice had been made over goblets of wine and rolls of parchment, signed with seals and witnessed by men who spoke of alliance and bloodlines with the detachment of merchants exchanging cattle. The wedding feast had been grand, the music loud, the wine flowing. She remembered little of it. Her hands had trembled beneath the veil, and the vows had sounded distant, like lines in a play she had rehearsed too often. That night, beneath the furs of their bridal bed, she had closed her eyes and recited Psalm 51, one line over and over. "Have mercy upon me, O God." She had borne 3 children in 6 years, 2 sons, 1 daughter. Her body, though pampered and perfumed, had suffered as all women's bodies did. The midwives came and went. Her screams echoed off the stone walls. Her bones ached with every birth, and afterward her days blurred into the routines of courtly motherhood, smiles for the nursemaids, lessons for the children, prayers in the chapel. But none of it was truly hers. She could not walk beyond the keep's gate without permission. She could not speak her mind before guests. She could not read what she pleased, only what the chaplain approved. Even her gowns were chosen for her, the fabrics imported. the necklines adjusted for modesty or appeal depending on the visitor. She was a painting in a gallery, beautiful and still, admired but untouched by her own life. Her only solace lay in the little window seat that looked east, toward the moors. There, beneath her breath, she whispered the names of the herbs she remembered from her mother's garden: lavender, marjoram, sweet woodruff, and imagined what it might be like to gather them barefoot, without audience or duty. Sometimes, when the moon was high and the tower cold, she took out a secret bundle, a set of letters hidden beneath a loose stone. They were not love letters, but letters of learning, from her childhood tutor who had taught her Latin verses and stories of ancient queens. He had once said to her, "The world will not hear you, Isolde, but that does not mean you must go silent." She had kept those words folded deep inside. Once, a minstrel came to court, a woman in traveler's garb with a harp strung in brass and eyes that gleamed like rain. She sang not of saints or kings, but of a fisherwoman who defied a duke. When she left, she gave Isolde a carved shell and whispered, "There are other lives, my lady, somewhere beyond these stones." The shell sat on her dresser still, a small, quiet rebellion. But rebellion, even gentle, comes with risk. One autumn evening, Lord Berengar entered her chamber unannounced, his face dark with wine and jealousy. He had heard whispers, servants speaking of Isolde's books, of her long hours at the window, of the minstrel. He accused her of vanity, of neglect, of secret longings unfit for a wife. She did not protest, she only bowed her head. He struck her once, not with fist, but with words. "You forget your place." After that, the door to her tower was locked each night from the outside. The key, she knew, hung from the steward's belt. Her children grew, her hair began to silver. She learned to nod with grace and speak with measured words. And yet, inside her, something remained untouched, a tiny ember glowing softly behind her ribs. She passed the years like a candle passes nights, burning quietly, never flinching. And sometimes, when the wind howled over the moors and shook the tower stones, she would press the shell to her ear, close her eyes, and listen. Not to the sea, but to the echo of a life that had never been lived, yet still breathed in the silence. Black Hollow was a forgotten crook of land, nestled between two stunted hills and a forest of ash trees that whispered like restless ghosts. Few passed through, and fewer still dared to linger. It was said that witches lived in such places, and though no one could name one outright, it was also said that death had its favorites, and they lived alone. At the edge of the hollow, where moss overtook stone and ivy hung like funeral veils, lived a woman named Mara. She had once been wife to a tenant farmer, mother to 3, and keeper of a warm hearth. But one by one, the things that filled her life had slipped away like mist at dawn. Her husband, Godwin, was taken by fever in a winter so bitter it cracked the stones. Her eldest son drowned crossing the ford. Her youngest daughter withered from within after the coughing sickness came through the hamlet. And her middle child, a boy of 10, was crushed by a cart in the Lord's service. Each loss carved deeper lines into her skin, each one an echo that haunted the cottage walls. Now she lived alone. The villagers called her Mara of the Hollow, in whispers laced with unease. They came to her only when their needs outweighed their fears, when a child's fever burned too hot, or a cow birthed wrong. They never stayed long, and they never met her eyes. Payment came in the form of eggs or firewood, dropped on her step without a word. She bore no mark of witchcraft. She did not curse, did not chant, did not carve sigils into the soil. But solitude itself was a suspicious thing. A woman unclaimed, unprotected, without husband or sons, such a woman was a gap in the order of things. And what society could not explain, it feared. Her garden grew herbs more out of necessity than magic. Thyme for sores, sage for grief, comfrey for broken bones. She knew the old remedies, passed from mother to daughter across generations. But each time she brewed a tea or packed a poultice, she wondered if the cure would become accusation. Some nights, stones struck her cottage walls. Children, emboldened by darkness and tales, ran laughing into the trees. Mara never chased them. She simply lit her lantern and sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a bowl of thin broth, listening to the night. She spoke to no one but herself. And the forest, the woods, at least, made no demands. They listened. The rustling leaves, the hoot of owls, the sudden crack of a fox through underbrush, these were her companions now. Once she had feared wolves. Now she feared the gossip of women far more. One market day, she dared to appear in the village square. Her cloak was patched, her boots caked with mud, but she walked with quiet dignity. She carried a basket of dried lavender and bonewort roots, hoping to trade for salt and soap. The crowd parted around her like water around a stone. A baker's wife crossed herself. A tanner muttered beneath his breath. Only the butcher's girl, no older than 12, offered a nervous smile. Mara nodded once, placed her herbs upon the stall, and waited. The apothecary arrived and eyed her wares. "These roots, where did you find them?" "The high ridge beyond the hollow," Mara answered softly. He frowned. "That land's unblessed. I'll take the lavender, leave the rest." She nodded again. No argument, no pride. She received less than the herbs were worth, but she did not protest. That night, a rooster died on a farmer's land. The next morning, a woman claimed her bread would not rise. By noon, 2 boys had fallen ill with a stomach complaint. By evening, the whispers began. Mara of the hollow, Mara with her roots, Mara who walks the forest alone. She heard them, faint as a funeral bell in fog. She did not light her lantern that night. She did not eat. She sat by the cold hearth, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and waited, not for visitors, but for the storm she sensed coming. It arrived 2 days later. A knock on the door. Firm, slow. When she opened it, 3 men stood outside, the reeve, the priest, and the blacksmith who held a torch. "There are concerns?" said the priest, his voice calm and clipped. "Concerns," echoed the reeve. "That must be addressed." Mara said nothing. She stepped aside. The men entered, their boots heavy on her clean-swept floor. They searched her shelves, her stores, her bed. The priest sniffed the air as though sorcery had a scent. The reeve unwrapped her jars, spilling powders with callous fingers. The blacksmith stood silent by the door. They found nothing. Yet when they left, the priest held a small carved figure in his hand, a charm from her daughter's cradle, long forgotten in a chest. "Idolatry," he declared. No charges were filed. No trial arranged. But the message was clear: leave or face what could not be named. She packed her things the next morning, what little there was, and walked with steady steps into the woods where no law reached and no eyes followed. She built a new shelter beneath the roots of an ancient oak, lined with moss and bark. She lived among the deer, drank from streams, and whispered stories to the trees. The village said she vanished. Some said she became a witch at last. But in truth, she simply became herself. No longer Mara of the hollow, but Mara of the forest, unchained, unseen, yet still breathing. And for the first time in decades, the silence she carried no longer weighed like a curse. It became a song. Down by the river, where the monastery walls cast long shadows across the reeds, the water sang its eternal song, a cold, ceaseless melody of current and stone. Here, crouched along the muddy banks, worked the women who labored unseen. Among them was Aldith, known only by her trade and her hunched silhouette, the washerwoman of St. Leora. She was neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor monstrous. Her back bore the shape of years spent bent beneath wet linen. Her hands, once nimble and pale, had long since hardened into knots of labor, cracked, red, and raw with lye. Her garments were always damp at the hem. Her fingers smelled of soap, her dreams of silence. Aldith had no husband. She'd once had a brother, a miller's apprentice, taken by a fever that darkened the skin and blackened the breath. Her mother had died bringing Aldith into the world. Her father disappeared one winter chasing debts or drink. No one knew which. The church had taken her in as a girl, not with comfort, but with duty. She'd grown up hauling buckets, scrubbing wooden floors, tending to the ill, and finally, at 15, joining the laundry ranks. At St. Leora, the monks prayed in the morning and in the night, their chants echoing off stone like ghostly incantations. Aldith, by contrast, began her day before the sun had warmed the sky. She lit the fire beneath the cauldron, fetched water from the river, sorted robes by blood, mud, and incense stains. There was a rhythm to it, but no joy. The work was endless, and no garment ever truly stayed clean. The robes of the priests, soft linen trimmed with gold thread, took the longest to wash. The threads frayed easily, and if they were damaged, she was whipped. The whipping was not violent, only deliberate. 3 lashes to the back of her calves, a reminder. She had not wept from pain in years. Most of her days passed in silence. The other washerwomen were either older and deaf or young and weary. Conversations were short, instructions even shorter. The nuns watched from the cloisters, silent as statues. They spoke only to direct or chastise. And yet Aldith endured. She endured the cold, the burn of soap and open cuts, the weight of wet cloth, the shrill caw of crows overhead as she worked through winter's bite and summer's sting. She endured the smell of rot on blood-soaked robes from the monastery infirmary, and the humiliation of kneeling in icy water when the laundry basins overflowed. Her body did not rest, but her mind wandered. While her hands scrubbed and twisted, her thoughts soared beyond the walls. She imagined a life where she rose with the sun, not before it, where she washed her own clothes and no one else's, where her back was straight, her voice heard, her name known. She imagined walking barefoot across a meadow, not dragging buckets down stone steps. Sometimes she composed songs in her head, simple rhymes about soap and steam, or strange stories about frogs dressed as abbots and geese who escaped the larder. She never spoke them aloud, but the songs were hers, and that made her days bearable. Once, a traveling scribe passed through the monastery and dropped his ink-stained tunic into her arms. "Wash it well," he said, barely looking at her. But when she turned it inside out, she found a folded scrap of parchment sewn near the collar. A prayer? A love letter? She didn't know. She couldn't read. She held the paper beneath her pillow for weeks, running her fingers over the marks in the dark. She imagined what they said. Perhaps it was a poem, perhaps a list, perhaps someone had written her name, though she knew that was impossible. She eventually burned the paper when a nun grew curious. But in her mind, the letters remained, etched like secret runes on her heart. The only moment of warmth in Aldith's life came from a cat, gray and gaunt, with one torn ear and eyes like green candles. It came to her each morning near the washing shed, winding around her ankles, purring with a sound more comforting than any hymn. She named it Thorn. No one else seemed to notice it, and so it became her companion. She spoke to Thorn in whispers. "You and I, we're not so different," she'd say, feeding it scraps of dried fish. "We do not belong, but we are here." The days wore on, each one stitched to the next like a worn hem. The monks continued their chanting, the robes continued to pile. Aldith's back grew more bent, her hands more calloused, but still she worked, each breath a form of resistance, each finished robe a quiet act of defiance. Then, one autumn morning, the abbot died. It changed nothing. The new one arrived with softer shoes and a sharper voice, but the robes still dirtied, the laundry still steamed, the world remained unchanged. Except for one thing. He dismissed the washerwomen from their task of laundering priestly garments, citing economy and efficiency. The monks would wash their own for penance, he claimed. Aldith was assigned to the cellar instead, sorting beans and drying herbs. Her hands, relieved of soap and steam, slowly healed. But she missed the river. She missed the song of it. Sometimes, when no one watched, she stole away to the banks and dipped her fingers into the current. It still ran fast and cold, whispering stories only she remembered. And when she died, years later, beneath a pile of folded burlap in the convent's storeroom, they buried her in an unmarked grave beyond the orchard. No bell rang, no name was etched, but the river remembered. It sang for her still. The fields stretched wide beneath the amber light of harvest, their rows of wheat swaying like ocean waves stirred by unseen winds. The scythes whispered through stalks with quiet resolve, and the air bore that strange scent of ripeness and endings, of grain ready to fall and summer slipping into memory. Idana stood barefoot in the stubbled earth, her skirts tied at the knee, sweat beading on her brow. The sun had yet to reach its peak, and already her muscles ached. Her hands, once meant for bread-making and child-rearing, had hardened into tools of the land. She swung the sickle with measured grace, steady and silent, just as she had learned to endure since the war took everything. Her husband, calm, had marched away 2 winters ago, called by the Lord to defend borderlands she had never seen. He'd kissed her once on the brow and said, "Keep the farm, Edie. Keep it breathing for me." Then he was gone. No letters came. No message arrived. Only a sack returned by the steward's man, his boots, a belt, and a wooden comb carved with her name. The war had claimed many, fathers, brothers, sons, but it was the women who were left to till the broken earth, to bury the old, to quiet the crying of children too young to understand why the bread grew thinner and the nights colder. Adana was not the only war widow in her hamlet, but she was among the few who had land. A small holding, 3 acres, a mule, and a one-room cottage that leaned like a tired woman in the wind. She had no sons to help her, only a daughter, May, who was nearing 12 and learning too quickly how to survive. Together, they learned to mend fences, patch thatch, dig ditches, and barter cheese for salt. When the rains came late, Idana walked miles to fetch water. When the mule grew ill, she nursed it with boiled barley and prayer. And when men rode past, strangers with swords and hungry eyes, she hid her daughter in the cellar, her own body braced with a pitchfork and a silence born of necessity. Grief did not cry out. It simmered like a pot left too long on the hearth. In the early days, Adana would wake each morning reaching for a body no longer there, the blanket beside her cool and undisturbed. At night, she sometimes swore she heard Colm's boots on the stone path, his voice calling out for soup or song, but it was only wind or her own weary mind. She had loved him, not with fire or poetry, but with that quiet companionship forged through shared burdens. They had survived bad harvests, buried 2 infants, weathered storms and debt. They had held hands in the dark, and now she held only memory. Still, she worked, for that was the only path left to women without men. She worked through rain, through frost, through pain in her hips and cracks in her soles. She worked with the dull rhythm of someone who no longer dreamed but did not yet know how to die. On market days, she walked the road to town with a basket of hard cheese, late apples, and sometimes eggs. The townsfolk nodded politely, but she saw the pity in their eyes. Widowhood was not a mark of tragedy, it was a warning. A reminder that all things, even love and security, could vanish. She kept her gaze low. She did not linger. One day, near the tail end of harvest, a rider approached the village bearing news from the northern border. Peace, he said. A treaty signed. The war was done. The Lord's men would not march again for a generation. The widow women did not cheer. They simply lowered their heads and went on mending their homes, knowing that peace had come too late for many, for husbands long buried, for sons never returned, for the youth they had spent like coin to keep the world turning while others bled. That evening, Adana stood beneath the old ash tree where Colm had once carved their initials. The bark had grown over the mark, smoothing it like time smooths stone. She placed her palm against it and whispered a name that still felt sharp on her tongue. I kept it breathing, she said. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but like one might say a prayer into wind. The harvest finished 2 days later. The barn was stacked, the last of the wheat stored. She baked a round of bread and split it with May beside the hearth. They did not speak much. There was little left to say, but there was a new steadiness in the silence. Later that night, May climbed onto the pallet and curled beside her mother. Will it always be like this? She asked. Adana looked to the rafters, where the shadows danced. No, she said softly. It will be harder. Then it will be easier. Then harder again, but we'll still be here. May nodded and closed her eyes. Adana remained awake, listening to the wind, to the quiet breath of a child learning how to survive, and to the faint rustle of wheat stored for a winter she no longer feared. She did not know what came next. But for now, she had the land. She had the girl. And she had herself, weathered, quiet, enduring, like the earth. The city rose in uneven tiers from the riverbank, its stone streets winding like old scars through rows of timbered buildings that leaned together as if whispering secrets. Bells rang from the cathedral tower every quarter hour, tolling not just time, but order, reminding all who heard that in this place, everything had its place. So too did Eleanor, wife to Master Willem Hart, merchant of dyes and woolens. Their house stood near the guild hall, a proud 3-story dwelling with shuttered windows, iron hinges, and a carved wooden sign that bore the Hart family crest, a stag bounding over a bale of cloth. Within those walls, the scent of wealth lingered, spiced soap, beeswax, ink, and imported wine. Fine tapestries softened the chill of stone. Books lined a locked cabinet. The hearth never lacked for fire. Eleanor wore linen so fine it rustled like paper, and her slippers were dyed in indigo brought by sea from distant ports. To those who passed her on the street, she was a portrait of order and fortune. But portraits do not breathe. She had married Willem at 16. Her father, a lesser cloth trader, had arranged it quickly when word spread that Willem was seeking a wife of mild demeanor and good childbearing hips. Eleanor met both requirements, and little else was asked. Her wedding had been swift but splendid. She recalled the weight of her veil, the press of strangers' hands, the waxy sweetness of the ceremonial rose wine. Willem had kissed her cheek and whispered, "You'll serve well," as if she were a ledger entry or a well-cut bolt of fabric. She became mistress of the house, but never of her time. Each morning she rose before the maids, checked the pantry, and oversaw the firewood. She balanced household accounts with ink-stained fingers, noting every coin spent on spices, thread, and candles. Twice a week she sat in the gallery and embroidered a new altar cloth for the chapel. Twice a month she was expected to dine with Willem's business partners, smiling as they spoke of tariffs and trade. She bore 2 sons in 5 years. The first was healthy, the second lived only a week. After the second child, the midwife warned her womb had thinned. "One more may break you," she said quietly. Willem never asked. He simply waited. In public, Eleanor was poised and gracious. She greeted the baker's wife, nodded to the apothecary, and handed out alms to the poor with a hand carefully gloved. But in private, when the shutters closed and the day's noise faded, she often sat at her desk with her quill and parchment, scribbling ledgers not of accounts, but of thoughts. She wrote what she could never say, of the loneliness that crept through her like chill through stone, of the way her husband looked at her, proud but never tender, of the dreams that came sometimes, unbidden, of a life where she might walk beyond the market square without a veil, speak to a man without fear, learn Latin not to copy names, but to read philosophy. One spring, a new servant joined the house. Her name was Muriel, a girl of 18 with a quick wit and soft voice. She polished the silver and sang as she worked, unknowing or uncaring that silence was the safer path for women in fine houses. Eleanor watched her with equal parts envy and worry. One day, she found Muriel weeping near the storeroom. The steward had struck her. She'd spilled a bottle of ink on the guest table's cloth. Eleanor did not ask questions. She only pressed a balm into the girl's hand and said, "Wash your face before the master sees." From that day on, Muriel moved more carefully. But she was not broken. She still sang when she thought no one listened. That defiance, small, unconscious, stirred something in Eleanor. Later that year, Willem left on a 3-month journey to Calais, taking with him 2 apprentices and a wagon of cloth. He left instructions for the accounts, for the steward, for the coopers and scribes. But not for her. He assumed, as always, she would wait. Instead, Eleanor unlocked the cabinet of books. Among them was a collection of Roman letters, Cicero translated into Norman French. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, the ink faded, the words dense. She read slowly, haltingly, by candlelight, whispering each phrase like an incantation. In those lines she found strange kinship, men speaking of duty, despair, the weight of expectation. She copied quotes into her own journal, burying them between accounts of flour and wool. When Willem returned, sunburned and smug with success, he kissed her forehead and spoke of new markets. She nodded, poured his wine, asked after tariffs, but her eyes no longer fluttered with fear. Something inside her had settled, quiet, firm, like a stone in deep water. Years passed. Her son grew. Muriel left to marry a cooper's son. New maids came and went. The city changed. Guilds rose and fought. New taxes were levied. The cathedral roof was retiled. But Eleanor remained the same, mistress of a house not hers, steward of a life made for another's comfort. And yet, each night before the candles were snuffed, she still wrote, not of rebellion, not of escape, but of truth. Soft truths, sharp truths, truths whispered by women who bore fine linen and silent sorrow. Her words were her own, and no man read them, but they breathed, and that she knew was enough. The wind came down from the hills like a whisper of old gods, rustling the hedgerows and stirring the thatch of cottages that crouched low beneath the weight of gray skies. In the small hamlet of Wetham Cross, where the church bell was cracked and the fields often flooded in spring, there lived a woman who knew the language of roots. They called her Leon, though most simply said, the herb wife. She lived at the edge of the village, in a cottage nearly swallowed by bramble and thyme. Her garden bloomed with strangeness, feverfew, wormwood, tansy, valerian. The children whispered that she spoke to her plants. The old men said she cured more than she cursed. And the women, especially the mothers, came when the priest's prayers failed and the infants burned with fever. Lian was not a witch, though many had come close to calling her one. She did not summon spirits nor speak the devil's tongue. But she knew how to ease childbirth with aniseed tea, how to draw out the poison of a sting with dock leaves, and how to silence a cough with syrup of elecampane. Her hands had soothed hundreds into sleep, coaxed babies into breath, and stilled the tremors of death more gently than any priest. And that, in the eyes of some, was reason enough to fear her. Her cottage was filled with jars, bundles, dried petals, and twisted roots. A cat lived by the hearth, gray as smoke. She worked in silence, her fingers sure and her gaze steady. She took payment in eggs, cloth, or sometimes only thanks. But always she listened. She listened to the forest, to the wind's mood, to the change in the bird song that warned of illness in the flock. She listened to women's voices, hesitant, cracking under shame, as they confessed things no man would forgive. The bleeding won't stop. He's hurting me. I cannot bear another child. Lian never judged. She simply opened her cupboard, poured her tinctures, and spoke soft instructions. For many years, that balance held. But balance is a delicate thing. One autumn, a child died. He had been sick with the pox, his tiny body racked with heat and sores. His mother had come to Lian in the night, desperate, cradling the boy as though sheer will could bind him to this world. Lian gave her willow bark, cool cloths, and a sleeping draught. But it was not enough. The boy died before dawn. The priest came to bless the corpse and found the herbs still steeping on the hearth. His face darkened. "Witch's work?" he hissed. The child was led not to heaven, but to silence. Within days, whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to threats. "She meddles with death," someone muttered at the alehouse. "She speaks in riddles and cures in darkness," said another. The fact that she had saved dozens was forgotten. The one who died became her measure. On a cold morning, the village reeve and 2 men-at-arms came with a writ bearing the abbot's seal. They searched her cottage, overturned her jars, split open her mattress. The herbs were called suspicious. Her book of remedies, written in plain English, was deemed dangerous. She was taken to the church cellar and locked behind a wooden door that smelled of mildew and fear. For 3 days, she was questioned. "Who taught you these arts? Do you consort with spirits? Why do women seek you instead of the priest?" Lian answered calmly, truthfully. "I learned from my grandmother, and she from hers. I listen. I heal. That is all." But they wanted trembling, tears, confession. She gave them none. On the 4th day, the bishop's man arrived from the city. He wore red velvet and carried ink-stained hands. His voice was smooth, his words practiced. "We will not burn you, Lian," he said gently. "We only ask that you denounce your methods, swear that your work was misguided, that you submit to the church's judgment." She looked at him through swollen eyes. "And what of the women who suffer in silence? They will find God." She did not laugh. She only closed her eyes and said nothing more. In the end, she was not condemned but exiled. "Leave before sundown," said the reeve, "and never return. Not to this land, not to these roads. You walk alone now." So she did. She took her cat, her knife, and a sack of dried roots. She walked past the church where the bells rang as if in mockery, past the home she had healed, past the child's grave, still unmarked, his mother's face hidden behind her shuttered window. Lian never looked back. She crossed moors and hills, forests and ruins, living on roots and silence. Sometimes she met other wanderers, tinkers, nuns, women with hollow eyes and bare feet. They nodded to her, recognizing her kind. A kind not born of darkness, but of knowing too much. Eventually, she came upon a glade where the earth was soft and the trees bent low as if to listen. There she built a shelter, simple but dry. She planted sage and garlic, hung rosemary at the door, and waited for need to find her again. It always did. The desperate do not care for decrees. They only care that the pain stops. And so, in time, her name was spoken once more, softly at night, in fear and hope. Lian, the woman of the woods, Not a witch, not a saint, but a woman who knew what it meant to bleed and not be believed, and still chose to heal. In a narrow croft beneath the long ridge of Ashenfell, where the hills curled like the backs of sleeping giants, there stood a cottage that always seemed too still. The shutters never opened wide. The smoke from the chimney rose in thin, nervous lines. No music played, and no laughter echoed from its walls. Within it lived a woman named Roswin and a man named Hugh. They were husband and wife by church and crown, bound with words spoken before a priest, witnessed by neighbors who had nodded and smiled and believed, perhaps, in beginnings. But beginnings meant little when the door closed and the vows faded into silence. Roswin had once been a girl of brightness. Her laughter rose like chimes in the wind, her hair wild with curls, her fingers quick at weaving. She had grown up beside a river, with brothers who teased gently, and a mother who taught her the names of wildflowers, and how to hide bruises with rouge when the priest's rod came down too sharply in the parish school. At 17, she married Hugh, a man respected for his field and feared for his temper. Her father arranged it with relief. A daughter married meant one less mouth, one less dowry to gather. He is stern, her mother whispered on the wedding night, but firm hands keep the house warm. Roswin nodded, already afraid. At first, there were only cold silences. A meal pushed away without thanks. The clatter of boots on stone that made her breath catch in her throat. Then came the slaps, sharp, sudden, always justified by some imagined offense. Burnt bread, a thread out of place, a look he didn't like. Then came fists. No priest spoke of it. No neighbor interfered. They saw the bruises, perhaps, but turned away. A wife must submit, they'd mutter. Better a hard man than no man. Roswin learned to move without noise. She timed his moods like the phases of the moon. She became expert at mending. Clay mugs, broken chairs, her own ribs. She bore one child, a boy named Aled. He cried often. Hugh despised the noise. Coddled like a wench, he snarled, striking the cradle with his boot. After that, Roswin learned to hush the child before his father's shadow crossed the threshold. The boy grew thin and pale. His laughter came rarely. By the time he could walk, he knew how to hide behind the kindling stack when boots stomped across the floorboards. And yet Roswin endured. Not for love, not for God, but for the boy. There were nights when she stood by the door, hand on the latch, the wind whispering escape. But always she turned back. Where would she go? Who would take her in? A woman alone was suspect. A mother without a husband, disgraced. The laws were not written for her protection, but for his property. So she stayed. She kept the house, cooked the stews, wove the wool, whispered songs to Aled in the dark when his father snored beside them. And in those whispered songs she wove a different world, one of still rivers, of kind hands, of days without fear. One winter evening, when snow covered the world in a muffled hush, Hugh returned drunk from market. His boots were soaked, his face red with cold and fury. No meat in the pot, he slurred. A man breaks his back, and his wife feeds him broth like a pauper? She said nothing. She had long since learned silence was the safest armor. He struck her across the mouth. Aled, only 5, threw a log at his father's leg. It thudded harmlessly, but the gesture rang through the room like thunder. Hugh turned, fists raised. That night, Roswin did not sleep. She sat by the fire until dawn, her son curled in her lap, her eyes dry as ash. Something in her had shifted, not broken, but hardened, like water turning to stone. She began hiding things. A small sack of oats beneath the hearth, a flint wrapped in cloth in the seam of her cloak, 2 iron nails buried behind the stable where Hugh never looked. Each day she planned, not escape, but survival. The next year, Hugh fell from a ladder mending the roof. He broke his leg badly. The bone pierced the skin. The healer was days away. Roswin bound the wound as best she could, but she added no willow bark to his broth. No sage, no thyme. The fever came. And she waited. When the healer arrived too late, she wept as expected. She wore the mourning black. She stood in the church with eyes lowered and hands folded. None questioned. Some said it was God's will. Others whispered the sin of drink. A few, mostly women, met her gaze and said nothing. But their silence rang with understanding. After the burial, she packed her things, took her son, left the cottage with only what she could carry. She settled in a village far to the east where no one knew her name. There, she took work spinning flax, her hands swift and practiced. Aled began to laugh again. He chased geese, climbed trees, sang songs. Sometimes, in quiet hours, women would come to her, sit near her loom, speak in soft tones of bruises, of fear prayers unanswered. She would nod. Say only this: you are not mad, you are not weak, you are not alone. And they would weep, and they would heal. So too did she. Not all at once. But day by day, stitch by stitch, the fabric of her life was rewoven, not without scars, but strong. And in the stillness of each morning, as the loom clacked into rhythm and her son's laughter rang outside, Roswin breathed not as a wife, not as a widow, but as a woman who had endured and chosen at last her own name. In the heart of Lord Halwick's manor, beyond the tapestried halls and candlelit chambers, lay a chamber few ever entered unless they had no choice: the kitchen. It was not a place of comfort or indulgence, despite the roasted meats and fragrant stews that passed through it. It was hot, smoky, relentless, its air thick with grease, and the barked orders of cooks too tired to be gentle. There, among the soot-dark beams and endless steam, moved a girl whose name was barely spoken, Nan. She had come to the manor at 10 years old, the youngest of 6, offered by her mother in exchange for a sack of barley and a promise that Nan would be fed. She was small for her age, with thin wrists and eyes that had learned early not to meet others directly. Her first task had been to scrub the floors after the evening roast. The grease hardened into the flagstones like scars. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her voice, once curious and bright, faded into silence, swallowed by fear, by fatigue, by the sheer immensity of doing everything right, and still being told she had done it wrong. Now at 16, she moved like smoke through the kitchen, quick, unnoticed, essential. The cook, Mistress Brada, rarely spoke her name. She snapped fingers and pointed, and Nan obeyed. Peel these turnips, pluck that goose, stoke the fire, stir the porridge. No pause, no complaint. She slept in a corner by the dry stores, on a pile of rough sacks that smelled of salt and oats. Her blanket was a torn cloak someone had discarded years ago. Her pillow, a bundle of her own skirts. She was never cold. Heat poured from the ovens like breath from a furnace, but she was always tired. Servant life was measured in hours, not days. And in those hours, Nan knew exactly how far to bend, how quiet to keep, how swiftly to vanish when tempers flared. There were rules unspoken but known. Do not be seen in the noble halls. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not cry where it can be heard. And above all, do not be alone with a lord or guest who stares too long. She had learned this one quickly. At 12, she had carried a tray of tarts into the feast hall. A knight visiting from another shire had touched her braid as she passed. "This one's ripe," he'd said, laughing. She had spilled the tray and been whipped for clumsiness. After that, she kept her hair hidden beneath a ragged coif. Only once had she spoken back. The steward's son, fat-fingered and spoiled, cornered her near the larder, whispered things he had no right to say. When she slapped his hand away, he cursed her, then accused her of theft. She was beaten, not for stealing, but for disrupting the order of things. The injustice burned hot at first, then cold, then not at all. She learned that silence was safer than truth. But she watched. She watched everything. Which servant slipped the duck fat into their apron, which knight kissed the scullery maid, which footman lied about the spilled wine. She learned the secrets of the manor not because she sought them, but because no one bothered to hide them from someone they did not see. And in that invisibility, Nan began to survive not just by obedience, but by understanding. She knew when to step away before the cook's blow landed, knew which stable boy would sneak her a heel of bread on cold mornings, knew when the mistress of the house was near tears and when the old butler's hands shook from drink. She saw, she listened, and quietly, she remembered. Her only joy came from the fire, not just its warmth, but its song. Late at night, when the others slept and the flames dwindled, she would sit near the embers and whisper stories to herself. Tales of queens in disguise, of maidens who tricked kings, of servant girls who flew on wings of ash and rose petals. They were stories her mother had told her once, before the barley, before the silence. One spring evening, as the manor prepared for a feast, the youngest son of Lord Hallwyck returned from his time in the city. He was freshly knighted, praised for valor and tournament, cloaked in silks and expectation. He saw Nan carrying platters. He watched her. And that night, he followed her into the pantry. She knew the signs. His voice was slurred with wine, his words careless. He called her pretty, promised gifts, reached for her arm, but Nan had been watching too long to be surprised. She stepped back fast, slipped behind a crate, knocked over a basket of dried apples, feigned clumsiness, and let the noise draw the steward. The knight laughed. "Stupid girl," he muttered. The moment passed, but Nan did not forget. She told no one, except the fire. That night she sat near the hearth and whispered, "They think I am nothing, but I see them all. One day they will choke on their secrets." She did not mean vengeance, only remembrance. In time, Nan grew taller, stronger. Her silence became not submission, but a fortress. Some began to call her Old Nan, though she was only 20. So ingrained had she become in the manor's bones. No one questioned her place. No one thanked her. But when the cook fell ill, it was Nan who took over. And when the mistress wept in the pantry over a lost child, it was Nan who brought warm milk without asking. And when the steward died suddenly, it was Nan who carried his keys to the Lord and bowed, eyes down but mind sharp. They never promoted her. But she never fell. In a world that crushed the noisy and ignored the gentle, Nan endured in her silence, sharp, steady, and unbroken. Where the kingdoms ended and the wilderness began, beyond the laws written in castle ink and beyond the reach of the bishop's hand, there sprawled the borderlands, raw, wind-torn, and cruel. It was a place of uneasy silence, of moss-covered stones and streams that ran red with clay and rust. It was a place men traveled through, never to, and where only the desperate remained. There, at the edge of a crag that looked eastward toward forests older than memory, stood a narrow cottage built from stacked stone and peat. Its roof sagged slightly, patched with heather and stitched by the hands of a woman no one called by name unless they dared. They knew her as Katrin of the Ridge. She was not young, nor was she old. Her age sat somewhere beneath the lines on her face and the strength in her arms, neither weathered nor wasted, but carried like a blade hidden beneath cloth. Her hair, once copper, had turned pale and gray with the years, thick braids often tucked beneath a scarf or cowl. Her hands were wide, cracked, calloused by rope, knife, and cold water. She had not always lived alone. There had been a man, Reese, tall and quiet, a hunter who had walked the same path from forest to door until the day he didn't return. That was 5 winters past. The wolves had howled louder that night. She never found his body, only his broken bow wedged between 2 stones and the scent of blood on the snow. She had buried an empty grave beside the thorn tree and carved his name into a slate with her own knife. Katrin stayed. Where would she go? Who would take her? A widow without child, without coin, without noble name. The borderlands, brutal as they were, offered one thing the manors and cities could not: solitude without question. Her hands could earn her living. Her silence was enough. The days passed in rhythms older than prayer. She rose with the mist, milked her 2 goats, chopped wood, boiled porridge, fetched water from the stream that cut through the valley like a blade. Her cottage had no lock, but she placed stones at the threshold each night. If they were disturbed come morning, she would know. Katrin was not feared, exactly, but she was not approached. The border was a place of raids, of shifting banners and sudden fires. The lords fought over land with wax seals and drawn swords, but no one governed the soil beneath her feet. The crown did not send taxmen. The church did not build chapels. Those who lived on the edge were forgotten, unless they were needed or blamed. The nearest village was 2 days away by foot. Katrin only went when she had something to trade: salt-cured venison, bundles of dried nettles, tinctures made from burdock and yarrow. She kept to herself, spoke little, and wore the same patched cloak each visit. Some called her wise. Others cursed she was neither. She was only enduring. In the 3rd winter after Riss vanished, riders came. Bordermen, half bandits, half scouts. They arrived with frost still on their cloaks and hunger in their eyes. 3 of them. She heard them before she saw them, hooves and snow, laughter thick with wine and threat. They knocked not as guests, but as owners. Katrin opened the door, not because she wished to, but because she knew what happened to bolted doors. The leader, tall, clean-shaven, red scarf at his throat, stepped in first. "We need warmth," he said, though it wasn't a question. She stepped aside. They took her fire, her bread, her ale. They asked no names, made no threats, but their eyes told her what their tongues did not. When one reached for the dried herbs hanging by the beam, she said only, "Touch that, and your fingers will rot before spring." They laughed, but the man stepped back. They left before dawn, drunk and grumbling. They took nothing more. Perhaps it was her tone, perhaps it was the glint of her blade left openly on the table, or perhaps they simply didn't want the trouble. But word spread. The woman on the ridge was not kind, nor afraid. She became a tale, half caution, half myth. In truth, Katrin was neither strong nor brave. She was weary. And weariness, when tempered by solitude and sharpened by loss, became a kind of shield no blade could pierce. Spring brought green to the hills, and with it strangers. A mother with 3 children fleeing conscription, a limping tinker with stories and broken pots, a girl who'd run from a master's hand. Katrin gave them water, bread if she had it. Never names. They left gifts in return, buttons, dried plums, a scrap of wool. Once, a carved figure of a fox. None stayed. But they remembered. She was not a midwife nor a healer, yet word reached mouths in far woods. The woman of the ridge sees with clear eyes. She does not pray, but she listens, and her silence is a safer place than most men's promises. At night, she sat by her fire, braiding her hair, mending nets. The silence no longer a burden, but a presence. Not the absence of sound, but the company of stillness. She did not miss the village bells. She did not long for market laughter. She missed only Riss, not for his strength or company, but for the way he had once cut kindling without being asked and left it stacked by the door. In time, her hands grew stiff, her legs slower. She accepted it. She needed no help. But one evening, as mist crept down from the ridgeline, a soft knock came at her door. She did not startle. She rose, steady as ever, blade in her belt, and opened it. A girl stood there, muddy, thin, eyes wide. "I've nowhere else," the girl said. Katrin looked at her a long while, then stepped aside. And in that simple motion, silent, sure, and full of unspoken understanding, the woman of the borderlands became more than myth. She became haven. The road to St. Berwin's shrine curved through wood and marshland, past crumbling chapels and crosses sunk deep into bramble. It was a path worn by centuries of feet, some devout, some desperate. Most were men, few were women. Fewer still walked it alone. Marta did. She wore a woolen cloak dyed the gray of weathered stone, patched at the elbow, frayed at the hem. Her shoes were thin, her walking stick carved from ash. A leather satchel, nearly empty, hung at her side. It carried a crust of bread, a strip of salted eel, and a ribbon once tied to a child's cradle. She left at dawn on the feast of St. Ealdwine, slipping away before the bells rang. No one knew she was gone. That was how she wanted it. Her husband had died 2 years prior, taken by lung fever that rattled his chest like wind through empty pews. Their son, her only child, had followed the next spring, claimed by a riding accident while chasing deer with a lord's retinue. His name was Hal. He'd been 16. Since then, Marta had wandered only in thought, between memories, regrets, and prayers that circled like smoke and never rose high enough to reach an answer. Until one night, in the stillness between dreams and waking, she felt it. Not a voice, but a pull. The shrine. Go. She did not ask why. She did not demand a sign. She simply gathered what she had, kissed the cold hearthstone once, and stepped onto the road. The journey was long, measured not only in miles but in the weight of each footstep, the silence between villages, and the wary stares of those who did not know what to make of a woman pilgrim, unescorted. The first night, she slept beneath a wayside cross, curled beneath her cloak, listening to owls. The second night, a kindly widow took her in, offering pea soup and a stool by the fire. But mostly, she slept in stables or hedgerows, waking stiff but grateful. She walked through rain that soaked her bones, through dust that caked her eyes. She walked with blisters, with hunger, with doubt trailing behind her like a shadow. But still, she walked. At a tavern near the River Sallow, a man asked, "What's a woman like you doing on the road alone?" She replied, "I go to pray." He smirked. "You can pray in your parish." "I already have," she said, and left. Word spread ahead of her, as it always did. Some called her mad, others called her holy. A few offered bread, more offered suspicion. But she did not seek blessing from them. She remembered her son's face too clearly to care for the judgment of strangers. Each day on the road became a liturgy of its own, each mile a psalm, each ache an offering. She whispered prayers as she walked, for Hal, for her husband, for the children of women who wept behind closed doors and had no road to walk. By the second week, her feet were bloodied. She could barely stand each morning. She soaked them in stream water and wrapped them in moss. Yet she pressed on. Sometimes she met other pilgrims, men in pairs or groups, singing hymns or muttering Latin she did not understand. They nodded, some with respect, others with unease. Once a young man offered to walk with her for safety. She declined, not because she feared him, but because the silence had become sacred. In it, she heard things she'd forgotten to notice, the beat of her own heart. The cry of curlews at dawn, the memory of her son's laugh reborn in wind. Near the town of Elmer, she passed a girl kneeling by the road, her dress torn, eyes red with salt. Marta offered her water. The girl wept without speaking. They walked together 3 days. The girl never gave her name. When they parted, Marta gave her the ribbon from her satchel. "For remembrance," she said, and then she walked on. When at last the spire of St. Berwin's shrine rose over the hills, tall, bone-white, wrapped in crows, Marta stood for a long while, not in awe, not in joy, but in quiet knowing. She had made it. The priests at the gate eyed her askance. She looked too poor to offer coin, too old to be prey. They let her enter without question. Inside, the air was thick with wax and incense. Pilgrims knelt in rows. Some wept, some recited prayers, others clutched tokens to their breasts, lockets, teeth, bones. Marta approached the shrine slowly, her hands trembling not from age, but from the weight she'd carried. She knelt. She did not pray for a miracle. She did not ask to be healed or to be given a sign. She simply closed her eyes and in the silence whispered the names of those she loved. Then she wept, not the weeping of pain, but of release. It was done. She stayed at the shrine for 3 days, sleeping in the cloister yard. On the third morning, she rose, bathed her feet, and began walking again, not home, but onward. For the road had changed her. She no longer needed answers. She had become one. At court, everything glimmered, stone polished to gleam like ivory, tapestries thick as woolen walls, silks that shimmered with every footstep. But beyond the music, beneath the laughter, and within the halls lined with painted saints and silent servants, life moved like a delicate game played by invisible rules. And in this game, always half a step behind the throne, was Ellen. She was a lady-in-waiting to the queen of the realm, one of many, yet distinct in her stillness. She did not shine the brightest, nor laugh the loudest. She did not court gossip, nor challenge the flow of rank. Instead, she endured, quiet, measured, ever watchful. Ellen had been brought to court at 13, daughter of a minor baron whose lands were more swamp than estate. Her father, burdened with debt and desperate to curry favor, had offered her to the queen's household in exchange for leniency. The queen, gracious and shrewd, accepted. From that moment forward, Ellen belonged not to herself, but to the world of lace-edged gloves, ceremonial steps, and secrets spoken in a whisper. She learned quickly. A lady-in-waiting was more than a servant, less than a peer. Her duties included dressing the queen, reading aloud during embroidery, warming the bedchamber with coals before the lady's arrival, and, most importantly, listening without ever being heard. She learned how to speak when spoken to, and how to bow lower for dukes than for counts. She memorized the hierarchy of table settings and the lineage of every noble family from the Channel to the Highlands. She practiced her smile until it rested on her face like a mask, a pleasant, unchanging thing. Her body became not her own, but an extension of etiquette. Her words not her own, but reflections of the queen's mood. Years passed. Girls came and went, Some married off, some dismissed, some vanished without mention. Ellen remained. She was not beautiful in the way songs described queens. Her features were fine, her posture impeccable, but it was her quiet gaze, steady, unreadable, that others noticed. It made men curious, women wary, and the queen fond. The queen called her my still water. "You see much, Ellen," she once said, stroking the pearl-studded ribbon in Ellen's hair, "but you say so little." Ellen smiled, as always, and replied, "That is how water best serves, your grace. Clear and calm." Behind that calm, Ellen collected what others discarded, knowledge. She knew which noble lady wept at night and why. She knew which courtier feared being summoned to the king's private council. She saw the footmen's stolen glances and the steward's second ledger, one for the crown, one for himself. She saw everything, but she did not speak. She had seen what happened to women who spoke. One spring, the queen's cousin was accused of whispering sedition, treason painted in careful language. A maid, young and frightened, claimed she'd overheard him mention the word usurp. That maid was brought before the chamberlain and questioned harshly. She wept, retracted, and was later found drowned in the well. The court grieved. The queen wore black. The cousin was quietly married to a foreign noblewoman and sent abroad. Ellen said nothing. But she began to write. Each night, in a small book hidden beneath the floorboards of her chamber, she scribbled what she remembered. Words said, glances exchanged, gifts given in dark hallways. It was not blackmail. It was preservation. Her own form of truth in a place where truth was always dressed in silk and hidden beneath veils. In her 5th year of service, the queen fell ill. The court fretted. Priests chanted. Physicians poured honeyed wine down her throat and pressed leeches to her spine. Ellen tended to her through it all, sponging her brow, singing the lullabies of her girlhood. When the queen recovered, she held Ellen's hand and said, "I trust you more than any sister." It was not love, not truly. It was possession disguised as affection. Ellen knew that. Still, the words settled deep. Then came the foreign envoy. Tall, clever, dark-eyed, a lord from a distant court full of wit and ambition. He watched Ellen from across the hall during a feast, then found reasons to linger where she served. He never touched her. He never had to. His words were enough. "You see all," he said one evening while she poured him wine, "but are seen by none. That makes you powerful." Ellen looked up briefly. "And invisible," she said. "Which is safer?" She did not answer. Later that week, he left. She found a rose pressed between the pages of her book. She burned it. Time pressed forward. The queen aged, bore 2 children, buried one. Ellen remained. Her body changed, her steps slowed, but her presence never faltered. The other ladies grew younger, fresher. She became a fixture, like the Queen's Hound or the painting of St. Cecilia in the hallway. When the king died, the court shifted. Whispers moved faster. The queen wept in private and ruled in public. Ellen stood beside her, dressing her in mourning black, pinning jet stones to her collar. The queen once said, "When I am gone, you must stay. Help the new queen as you've helped me." Ellen said, "If she allows, she will. I will insist." But when the queen died, peacefully, in her sleep, wrapped in lavender sheets in memory, the new queen did not ask Ellen to stay. "You are too close to the past," she said gently, "and the past must be buried." And so Ellen left court. She was granted a house near the coast, with roses climbing the walls and a view of the sea. There were no servants, no bells, only silence. She walked the shore each morning, watching waves devour the stones and recede again. She wrote in a clean book, fresh pages filled not with secrets, but with moments. A girl laughing beside a window, a queen singing softly to her child, a rose pressed between pages, then turned to ash. Ellen lived quietly. No statues were built for her, no poems penned, but in the stillness of her garden, surrounded by rosemary and sea wind, she remembered it all, because she had seen everything. And in a world of masks and mirrors, that was a kind of power few ever understood. The convent bell tolled low over the mist-shrouded hills, a dull iron voice marking the hour of prayer. It echoed beyond the cloister walls, beyond the fields and hedgerows, and deep into the cold belly of the priory, a place of stone and silence. Beneath that bell, in a room no larger than a stable stall, sat a woman with her head bowed and hands folded in her lap. They called her Sister Angeline now. But once, she had been simply Ismay of Lomere, daughter of a baker, known for her bright laughter and for dancing barefoot in the rain. That life was gone, worn away by years, by judgment, by faith, and by the stone that surrounded her on all sides. Her cell was bare, one straw pallet, one wooden crucifix, one bowl, one jug of water. No window, no fire. A slit in the wall allowed the passing of bread and thin broth, and once a week a priest read psalms through the grate. She was not a nun. She was a penitent, sent here to purge sin. The offense? A child born out of wedlock. The man had vanished. Some said a soldier, others a merchant's clerk. No one asked closely. When her belly grew, the whispers began. Her father wept. Her mother said nothing. The priest called it wickedness. The child lived for 2 days. Ismay, then barely 19, had named him Tomas and buried him near the riverbank where bluebells grew in spring. They found her by the disturbed earth. There was no trial, only confession, tears, and the heavy judgment of the abbey. You will not be hanged, the bishop had said, but you will serve your penance in silence as befits a woman who defied the Lord's path. So she was sent to the priory, clothed in gray, her hair shorn, her name erased. It had been 10 years. Her voice had faded to a whisper. Her hands grew thin, her skin pale as lye. She rose at every bell, kneeled at every prayer. She whispered confessions long after the memory of sin had grown dim. She lived by rote, each breath offered in supplication, each step a chant of forgiveness. But penitence, like grief, does not remain pure. Over time, doubt crept in, slow and soft as ivy through a crack in the wall. She began to ask, was her sin in love? In birth? In naming a child no one else would claim? The priest who came on Fridays never answered her questions. He read the scriptures, gave her water, sometimes offered a small psalm of mercy, but never looked her in the eye. Other nuns passed her cell without speaking. She heard their footsteps like the ticking of a clock she no longer followed. They brought her food, changed her linen, never lingered. Once, a novice dropped a prayer book outside her door. Ismay reached for it, trembling as if it might burn her hands. She read it in secret by candle stub. Stories of saints, of Mary Magdalene, of women healed and redeemed. She read it until her lips moved unconsciously in rhythm. Then she rewrote the psalms in her mind. She began to hum, not loudly, only under her breath. A melody remembered from childhood, the lullaby her mother once sang. One evening she dared to speak aloud. Tomas, she whispered into the dark, I remember you. No thunder came, no curse, only silence. She spoke again the next night and the next, until her son's name became her liturgy. Then, one spring morning, a new voice came to the grate. A young sister, nervous, kind-eyed. I brought your broth, she said. Ismay blinked, unused to gentleness. Thank you, she whispered. The sister lingered. Is it very hard, she asked, to live alone? Ismay looked up, slowly. Yes, she said, but it is harder to be forgotten. The sister nodded, eyes glistening, and left. From then on, the young sister came often, sometimes humming a hymn, sometimes sharing bits of news from beyond the wall. She spoke of the garden blooming, of a calf born in the convent's pasture, of birds nesting near the chapel roof. She brought flowers once, daisies, wrapped in cloth. Ismay held them like relics. She no longer felt quite so invisible. Still, the years had hollowed her. Her bones ached, her sight dimmed, but inside something stirred. Not rebellion, not hope, but memory. The core of herself not yet erased. One night, during a storm that shook the priory with wind and water, she lay awake listening to the howling. And for the first time in years, she did not pray for forgiveness. She prayed for Tomas. Not that he forgive her, but that he had found light. I would have loved you, she whispered into the thunder. I did love you. The storm answered with silence. But silence no longer frightened her. Months later, the bishop came to inspect the priory. He did not stop at her cell, but the young sister did. She sat beside the wall and said, They will let you out. Ismay blinked. After so long? She asked, her voice trembling. The girl nodded. You are to take vows if you wish. Join the order fully. Ismay said nothing. Later, alone, she thought long into the night. Freedom was not always a gate swinging open. Sometimes it was a name remembered. Sometimes it was a flower pressed between pages. Sometimes it was silence, kept and then broken. And when the sun rose and the bell tolled once more, Ismay stood and smoothed her robes. She walked from the cell not as prisoner, not as penitent, but as a woman who had endured the weight of shame and emerged still whole, still singing. In the heart of the town of Westmere, where the streets wound tight as knotted string, and guild banners flapped from every beam and rafter, the sound of hammers rang steady against the early morning sky. Sparks flared behind shuttered smithies. Carpenters sharpened tools. Stonecutters inspected slabs with calloused fingers. It was a town of craft and trade. And in one shadowed workshop off the market square, beneath the sigil of a gilded compass and chisel, a girl bent over a length of wood, carving slow and careful lines. Her name was Mirwin, and though her apron bore sawdust and stains like any apprentice, her presence raised eyebrows the moment she stepped into the guild yard. She was not supposed to be there. Mirwin had become the woodcarver's apprentice, not by favor, but by persistence. Her father, once a journeyman carpenter, had died of an infected wound when she was just 10. Her elder brothers left for war or sea. Her mother, resigned and proud, took to weaving and prayer. But Mirwin had no taste for thread. She had watched her father shape beams for a chapel arch, had touched the spiraled columns he left behind. She remembered the smell of pine and oil, the way shavings curled from the plane like ribbon. Her hands itched to hold a chisel. Her eyes followed the grain of timber like a map. At 12, she approached the guildmaster. He laughed in her face. "At best, you can sweep the floors," he said. "Your arms are too thin for a mallet." But she returned the next day, and the next. By the 5th, he told her to fetch water. By the 10th, to sand a stool. When she corrected a crooked joint on a journeyman's box without being asked, he stared at her for a long moment and muttered, "Stay then. That was 4 years ago." Now 16, Mirwin worked alongside men twice her age and half her humility. She earned no praise. She was not allowed to sign her work. The journeyman still called her Mouse. The master referred to her as the girl. But her hands were sure, her measurements true, her carvings clean. Still, respect did not come. Once, during winter, the smith's apprentice tripped her and laughed as her tools scattered across the stones. "Try the spinning room," he said. "You'd make a better wife than Joiner." She said nothing. But that evening, she stayed late to repair a splintered window in the guild hall without being asked. She left it oiled and perfect. No one spoke of it. But the master's next order went to her alone, a pair of angels for the abbey choir stalls. It was the most delicate commission the shop had received all season. She worked on it in silence, deep into the evenings, hands stiff from cold, breath rising in clouds as she bent over the oak. She carved wings feather by feather, expression by expression, one angel singing, one mourning. She poured into them everything she could not say aloud. When she presented the work wrapped in linen, the master only grunted, passable. But she saw how long he stared. The monks said nothing of the sculptor's name. The choir sang as if the angels had always been there. Weeks later, a traveling merchant passed through Westmere, seeking an apprentice for his wood shop in the distant city of Colchester. He asked the guild for their finest work. The master showed him the angels. The merchant asked, "Who carved these?" The room fell still. No one answered. Mirwin stood in the corner, silent, her fingers stained with resin, a chisel tucked into her belt like a dagger. That night she sat by the hearth with her mother, unwrapping bread. "I was never meant to," she said, "but I did." Her mother took her hand, rough and scraped, and pressed it between her palms. "You did," she said. That spring, the guild allowed her to take the journeyman's test, a rare concession. The exam was simple, in theory. Carve a panel depicting the life of St. Wolfram. She chose the moment he gave bread to the starving. For 3 days and nights she worked, her hands cramped, her eyes blurred. She bled onto the wood more than once. But when it was finished, it stood as tall as her chest, each fold of robe, each grain of bread, each face carved in quiet reverence. When she placed it before the council, no one spoke for a long time. Then the master said, "She passes," not with joy, but with truth. She was not offered a place in the guild, but she was not dismissed. She continued to work. More orders, better tools, still no title. Her name remained unspoken in contracts, her hand unmarked on the panels she shaped. But the merchants began to ask, quietly, did the girl make this one? She had become a rumor, a shadow in the shop, a craftsman in all but name. Years later, after the master died and the guild hall passed to new hands, she left Westmere. She took nothing but her tools. She traveled east, setting up a bench in a market where no one knew her, carving saints for churches, boxes for brides, staffs for bishops. She signed each piece beneath the base, small, hidden, M of Westmere. She never married. She never begged. She built her own name in chips and sawdust, in every stroke of blade against grain. And when she died, her hands were still calloused, still curled as if gripping a chisel. One of her angels still stands, high in the rafters of St. Hildegard's nave, wings wide, mouth open not in song, but in the quiet gasp of freedom. Few know who carved it, but the wood remembers. And that is enough. In the hush that falls between night's last watch and dawn's first breath, there lies a silence deeper than sleep. Not the silence of peace, nor that of forgetting, but the silence of stories left untold. And in that hush, beneath cathedral stones and farmyard paths, behind the smiles of tapestries and the inked boasts of kings, rest the names of women. Most have been lost to time. Not by accident, but by design. For history, when penned by victors and bound in gilded volumes, rarely grants space to those who did not wield sword or seal. It remembers the battles, not the births. It sings of lords, not laundresses. It erects statues for conquerors, not for those who bore their children, scrubbed their floors, buried their brothers. Yet even in that neglect, the women remained. They lived beneath laws not of their own making, prayed to gods who spoke with male voices, and toiled in fields and kitchens where no praise ever followed. They stitched linen until their eyes failed, bore pain without respite, and mourned quietly, lest grief be deemed unruly. But still, they endured. There was Roswin, who sang to herself as her husband's fists bruised her ribs, and who one day simply walked away. No one recorded where she went. But the well she dug with her own hands in a northern glen served travelers for years after her death. There was Mirwin, who carved saints with the skill of angels, but whose work bore another man's name. Yet her lines remained in oak and ash, elegant, stubborn, and unmistakably hers. Katrin, who never bent the knee to lord or priest, who lit her own hearth, tamed her goats, and trusted no law but the seasons. Sister Angeline, who entered her cell in shame, and emerged years later cloaked not in penance but in clarity. Marta the pilgrim, who walked until her feet bled and her soul quieted, not seeking miracles but offering her grief to the road itself. And hundreds, no thousands more. The midwives who risked the stake to bring life safely into the world. The alewives accused of witchcraft when their brews outsold a neighbor's. The mothers who named their daughters strong names in defiance of silence. The daughters who watched, who listened, who remembered, even as the world forgot them. Their stories were not carved in stone. They were whispered, and in that whispering, they survived. Theirs was not a power born of armies or bloodlines. It was quieter, more persistent, a woman teaching another how to grind herbs against fever. A widow showing her niece how to mend boots so they'd last another winter. A stranger leaving bread on a doorstep where hunger crouched. A girl scribbling her name beneath a beam, knowing it would never be read. They did not lead revolts, but they rebelled in other ways. By living, by loving, by refusing to break, even when the world cracked around them, even when their words were stolen and their dignity traded like coin. Even when they were called temptress, burden, mistake. They remained, not as saints, not as martyrs, but as women. The kind who bury their dead and still rise before dawn to milk the goat. The kind who carry secrets like saints carry relics. The kind whose tears fall silently, then dry into steel. History forgets such women easily, but the earth does not. She keeps their footprints in forest paths, their sweat in the grain of kitchen boards, their breath in lullabies passed down too many generations to name. She remembers the way they stirred pots clockwise for luck, the songs they hummed when gathering wild garlic, the warning tales they wrapped in bedtime fables. Their names may be dust, but that dust is holy. Not the kind stored in reliquaries, but the kind that settles on everything, quiet, constant, present. If you listen closely in the stillness, you may hear them. In the creak of old stairs walked by countless feet, in the hush of a chapel just after prayer, in the rustle of a shawl passed from grandmother to girl. And when you do, you might remember that history is not only what we inherit, but what we choose to preserve. The brutal lives of medieval women were not merely tales of suffering. They were sagas of survival. They were acts of resistance written in kitchen soot and river mud, in prayer and in patience. They were lives that mattered, even when no one wrote them down. And so now, as the candle burns low and the air grows still, let us close this story not with sorrow, but with reverence. For every woman forgotten, there was one who remembered. For every injustice endured, a breath taken in defiance. For every name lost, another waits to be spoken.